This is going to be a surprising program, I expect, for several of you in terms of the content, but more about that in a minute. We're going to talk about Paul Gauguin. He was born in Paris in June of 1848, and he died in the Marquesas Islands, French Polynesia, in 1903. He was just 54 years old. And yet, if you're an art teacher, an art student, an art historian, or just somebody who loves art, you recognize the name of Paul Gauguin. I'll tell you, he was a very controversial figure in his family while he was alive. So much so that one of his wives referred to him as Darwin's missing link. And that was because he decided to leave everything that he knew well in Western civilization and spend his life with the indigenous peoples in the Marquesas. Before and after his death, he was a very controversial figure in art. Art circles really can't peg him. They can't agree exactly where to put him. Some think he's the early modernist. Others say, no, he's an impressionist. Others, he's a realist. Others, a symbolist. Doesn't matter. He can't be pegged. That's what makes him so fascinating. All, though, agree that his art was influential to a degree in his lifetime and to a much greater degree in the years that loaded past his death. He continues to influence artists today. The first painting of his that I wanted to show you today, as we kind of work through this fellow, is one called Hail Mary. It's his interpretation of Madonna and Child, Holy Mary and the Christ Child. And on this one, you can see that Mary is dressed in Polynesian dress. She's got a red kind of sari on, and the Christ Child is on her shoulder, leaning over with his head on top of her head. He's obviously taking a little nap. And then beyond, some ladies are coming to pay homage to him. Gauguin painted this one in 1891, so it's kind of close to the end of his life. He fuses Western religious iconography with the spiritual and visual qualities of Tahitian native life. Simply put, Gauguin was a maverick. He ignored rules that had been followed in art for centuries. He developed a multi-point perspective, which was new and unique to him. And he did something else, which I think is probably the most interesting about his art. He used color based on emotion rather than reality. He famously said one time, if you see a tree and you see it as blue, then paint it as a blue tree. That made for some very interesting canvases. He pioneered merging indigenous themes with Western art. When he sent an original painting of a Madonna and Child as Polynesian natives for exhibit in Paris, the traditionalists were horrified. This is a little clip from a book review of Wild Thing, which is the book I'm going to introduce you to in a minute. It's from a little column that was called A Hungry Wolf Without a Collar, which I think is an absolutely superb description of Gauguin in the Marquesas. It was done in 2024, and Elizabeth Lowry wrote this. Paul Gauguin was Vincent van Gogh's nemesis, the amoral genius who ditched his wife and family to flit off to French Polynesia. Paul Gauguin is the bad boy of modernist painting. His image, which he wasn't averse to cultivating as the savage prince of European art's end of the century, counterculture, was already taking shape in his lifetime and has informed his legend ever since. The book she's talking about is this one, Wild Thing. It's Full title is Wild Thing, A Life of Paul Gauguin. It's written by Sue Prideaux, published by Faber and Faber, and it was published on June the 5th, 2025, so it's very new. There have been innumerable books and articles written about Gauguin and his art, not to mention countless scholarly papers printed at professional art and humanities and literary conferences throughout the world. Paul Gauguin's art is influential, but it's also puzzling, even to those who've spent their careers trying to understand it and to understand him. While I looked at many of the possible sources for this program, I happily settled on one of the most recent ones, and it drew my attention because of the kind of honors that it received as a book about an artist following its publication. Here are some things that it was listed for. Excuse me. It was listed as one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2025. It was one of the New Yorker's top books of 2025. It was one of Vogue's best books of 2025. One of the Wall Street Journal's best books of the year. One of the New York Public Library's best books of 2025. It was one of the Chicago Public Library's best books of 2025. It was shortlisted for the 2024 Bailey Gifford Prize, and it was the winner of the 2025 American Library in Paris Book Award. And finally, it was longlisted for the 2025 National Book Critics Circle Award. That's a lot for a biography about an artist who's been dead for a long time. Who wrote such an outstanding and attention-getting biography? Who is Sue Prideaux? Well, her background, she's English and Norwegian from Norway. She is a writer. She was educated as an art historian. She was born in 1946 in London. She's written a few novels and a few biographies, but this is where she scored. At 80, she has one of the most amazing books about an artist that's hit the press. Gauguin's life story has been sprinkled liberally with many less than complimentary myths that have just been told over and over again and taught over and over again, many associated with his rather indifferent approach to love and marriage. In 2000, the site of Gauguin's last home in the Marquesas was cleared. The house that he had built was long gone, but there was a spot. They knew where it was, and so they started looking around. And they found a deep well there, and in that well, they found a jar that had human teeth. They did forensic exams to prove that these were indeed Gauguin's teeth. There were 4 of them. Tests were carried out for cadmium, mercury, and arsenic because these were the standard treatments for syphilis at the time. They all leave mineral deposits in the teeth. Gauguin's were completely free of them. Unlike the legendary Gauguin, the real Gauguin did not die of syphilis. Lowry, as she continued her book review, wrote, "In 2020, there was a second surprise, the manuscript of the artist's long-lost memoir, Before and After, which he wrote during the last 2 years of his life. It suddenly reappeared. For the first time, we've had access to Gauguin's uncensored thoughts about his motivations and about his life." It was amazing stuff. Prideaux, in her preface to Wild Thing, writes, "The manuscript went missing soon after his death, and a messed about version purporting to be authentic was published as Paul Gauguin's Intimate Journals in 1918. Subsequent books and biographical assumptions have been based on that false book. Now we have the real thing." More importantly, Prideaux has the real thing, and she's an art historian who understands that what she understood to be true about Paul Gauguin in many ways was not true at all. This manuscript was handwritten by Gauguin the final 2 years of his life. It's 213 pages long. It's interspersed with numerous pen and ink drawings, as well as many monotypes depicting landscapes and the people of the Marquesas. In it, in his own words, Gauguin dispels many of the conventional wisdom truths about him and his art that have dominated critical thought until it was discovered. There are some very surprising revelations, but 3, I think, are most important for us to understand about him for the program today. Before and after proves that Gauguin was not a colonialist, as has been widely believed and taught. The manuscript included passages in which he excoriated colonialism and included excerpts from letters that he had written to the government, citing cases of injustice and corruption within the French colonial government in the Polynesian islands. He asked the government to lower taxes on the indigenous peoples there. The writing also shows that Gauguin strongly supported equal rights for women, a most unusual position in that day and time. And the third thing, it shows that he loved Jesus Christ, but he hated the formal church. Prideaux mixed this manuscript in with what was already known and proved about Gauguin, and this manuscript became the primary source for her Gauguin biography. Her having access and having the background, the attention to Gauguin for all those years really meant that she could take this manuscript and see immediately where the differences were in what had been taught and what had not. That's the key to the scholarly value of this very detailed look at Gauguin's life. A second painting I wanted you to see is When Will You Marry? Gauguin painted it in 1892. It's listed as post-impressionist, but as I've already said, he really can't be tagged with any one thing. This is a painting that shows his combining of Western culture with Polynesian culture. If you look closely at the two women, the woman in the background is dressed as a European woman would dress. She's still obviously a Tahitian, but she has her hair pulled back into a little hairstyle with a bow that would be appropriate to Europe. And she's wearing a dress with a necklace that, again, is European. In the foreground, though, you have a Tahitian lady, and she's dressed in traditional Tahitian garb. She has a fresh flower in her hair. She's wearing the red skirt that was appropriate for that time, and she's looking a little bit away. The reason I believe that Gauguin has the Tahitian in the foreground is because it was his preferred form of life. He died in abject poverty in 1903, and his poor artwork at the time was virtually worthless. This oil painting by Gauguin that he painted in 1892 sold in 2015 at auction for $300 million, the second most expensive buy at auction. It had sold just a few weeks after Gauguin died for 7 francs. I love his signature. I think if you're going to be an artist, be an artist. And his signature is as unique and dynamic as his art. Paul Gauguin's childhood was divided into 2 halves and between 2 different countries. The two halves could not have been more different in terms of language, culture, and his personal status. First half of his childhood, he was born in France, but he spent his early childhood in Peru with his mother's family. There he mastered Spanish, he absorbed the Peruvian culture, and he lived a life of privilege, complete with his own personal servants. When he was an adult, he said that he always preferred speaking Spanish. And of course, it's because it was his first language. The second half of his childhood, beginning about age 7 to 8, he spent back in France. There he struggled with the language, with the culture, and a life of want where he had to fend for himself, no more personal servants. And it was Gauguin's parents who were responsible for this divided childhood. His father, Clovis, was born in 1814, died in 1849. He was a very radical, liberal French journalist and newspaper editor in Paris. But his career, indeed in some instances his life, was threatened in 1848 when the French Revolution occurred and Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. In 1849, Clovis became a political refugee, and he moved his family to Peru to live near his wife's family. Gauguin was born in Paris, but he has no memory of it. His father's need to escape the political upheaval in France meant that the family sought the refuge where they could. And Clovis had hoped, upon arriving in Peru, being able to start another very liberal newspaper there. The trek from France to Peru was arduous. Paul was 18 months old on the ship. His sister Maria was 2.5 years old when their father died on board, en route to Peru. They had just spent 3 months crossing the Atlantic, and they were in port to get fresh water in southern Chile. While on an excursion off the ship, Clovis died of a heart attack. He was buried immediately in a small cemetery at a fort near the Straits of Magellan. And basically, that's all people knew. It wasn't until 2016 that his burial site was discovered. His widow and his 2 children left the following day after his burial, now widowed and near orphan, to Peru. His mother, Aline Maria Chazal, was a very strong woman. She was the daughter of a proto-socialist leader, Flora Tristan. She was a very early feminist whose father was a member of a wealthy Peruvian family, and so she could be radical in her thoughts and pushing the rights of women. No doubt Gauguin heard stories about his grandmother, and that was one of the things that influenced him to be very supportive of women's rights. The new widow made her home in Lima with her children for 4 years in the home of her uncle and his family. During that time, she admired pre-Columbian pottery. She had not seen it before, and she started collecting it, in particular the pots of the Inca. And in Peru, she dressed in Peruvian clothing. This is a child now growing up with a mother who is looking like the native population. She's not looking Western. Plus, she's introducing him to some pottery, some art that he's going to love. Paul lived his early childhood in Lima, Peru. It was a wonderful life for him. He lived the life of a privileged child, moving among his maternal family's palatial estates. Life, though, was not so wonderful for his mother. She also lived a privileged life, but an inheritance that she had been promised by her grandfather never materialized. When the promise of a smaller inheritance from family in Paris appeared, she decided it was time to move back to France with her children and settle there, which she did in 1855. Paul moved with his family to Orleans when there was clearly no real financial future for them in Peru. Gauguin's mother chose to move her family to Orleans, which is located just a little south of Paris, and they lived there with Gauguin's paternal grandfather. Gauguin's mother started a little sewing business, seamstress business, that helped her to take care of her family. In Orleans, Gauguin began his formal education. He didn't like it. He was not an outstanding student. He didn't understand the language. He could talk in Spanish all day long. He didn't know what French was. He had no idea about that, so that complicated things. When he reached 17, he happily joined the Merchant Marine so that he could fulfill his country's compulsory service requirement. And then when he was 20, he joined the French Navy. He wanted to see the world. He served until 1872, when he returned to Paris and began working in the career his mother and his grandfather felt would be best for him, banking and working as a stockbroker. Paul's life took him all over the tropics while he was involved with the military. When he was in his middle to late years, home became not France, not Peru, but French Polynesia. Specifically, he found his artistic creativity heightened by the primitive peoples and their way of life in the Marquesas. Before Paul settled in the Marquesas, though, he tried earnestly to live his life in a conventional manner. It just didn't remain conventional. His desire to create art in multiple forms, paint, sculpture, pottery, printmaking, kept getting in the way of that conventional life. I would imagine that many of you watching this don't know that Paul Gauguin was a banker and a stockbroker at the beginning of his attempt to live a conventional life. His life was a struggle. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to live in a conventional, socially acceptable manner. But art kept getting in the way. I think it's important to kind of look at his development as an artist alongside with what's happening in his private life to be able to really get a better understanding of his paintings. After he completed his military service with the Royal Navy, we know that he did, during the time at sea, some limited line drawings, but nothing. Certainly he had never painted. He didn't any of that sort of thing. When he got through with military, though, he embarked on a career in banking, which led to one as a stockbroker at the Paris Stock Exchange. He was quite successful at it. He earned at one point the equivalent of $150,000 per year. But his growing desire to create art began taking his attention away from the desk, and he began painting as a hobby in 1871. This is one of his paintings, one of his early paintings, 1880. He entitled it Still Life with Fruit and Lemons. It was a very early attempt to paint a traditional still life, such as he was seeing being painted in France. He painted while he still had his financial career, and during this successful career, he collected paintings. He bought Manet, he bought Monet, and he bought Renoir. So he knew the good stuff, and he was buying the good stuff when it was really cheap, and he was trying to paint like these people were painting. He eventually took evening classes at the Academy, where he studied with Pissarro and Cézanne. This particular early work, The Lemons and the Fruit, is usually placed in the Impressionistic school, but remember, you can't really peg him. But it does show the influence of Monet, Pissarro, and Renoir. Along the way, he fell in love. He met Mette Gad and made her his wife. She was a Danish woman from Copenhagen. They had 5 children together: Emile, Aline, Clovis, Jean-René, and Paolo. The couple lived comfortably middle class in Paris for 10 years. Then in 1883, he left his stockbroker job and moved to Rouen, France, to focus on creating art for a living. Now, to be fair, the stock exchange crashed. He could have continued working with banking and he could have continued working with stock, but it would have been a climb up a pretty steep hill for the next several years. And he saw it as his opportunity to make a living with his art, to see if he could. He did that, and Mette returned to Denmark with their children. It's a long way away from France, but it was home for her. In 1884, he joined Mette and the children in Copenhagen, but didn't stay very long. He tried to work in business there, selling French tarpaulins to the Danes, but he couldn't speak the language and they didn't want any French goods, so he failed miserably. The following year, 1885, Mette and her family finally asked Paul to leave Denmark because he had renounced the values that the family shared. He returned to Paris, and within a year, he had begun informally separating from his wife and children. He was really willing to give it all up to focus on producing art. Even so, his deep love for Mette resulted in a perfectly gorgeous marble bust sculpture that he created in 1877. You can see here, it's one of the very few sculptures that he did, but you can see it's fine work, it's beautiful, and it sort of pays homage to the mother of his children. It's an exquisite marble bust. It's one of the very few he ever produced during his lifetime. But when you look at this, you realize his talent was enormous. He loved Mette, she loved him, but after 1891, the two never saw each other again. She continued to help both to get his art into exhibitions and to sell it, but their relationship was over. In 1887, he traveled to Panama with a lot of other people were doing the same thing to get work on the building of the new Panama Canal. He hoped to be able to make enough money there so he could paint for a while and produce canvases and maybe start making a living at art. He was fired after 2 weeks. So he moved to Martinique, where he spent the next 4 months trying to distance himself from Western civilization. He was immediately attracted to the wonderful colors and the climate in the islands, and he was fascinated by the primitive island culture he found among the peoples there. In 1887, he painted this masterpiece. It's called The Mango Trees, Martinique. It's a perfectly beautiful one. The whole time he was there, those 4 months, he actually painted 17 key works, mostly vibrant, sun-drenched, some landscaping, some figures. It was only a short visit, but it showed Gauguin's move toward even better use of color and symbolism. The Mango Trees, Martinique is considered one of his best of those that he painted during this first trip. In it, though, he ignores the poverty and the daily hard work required of the native peoples. Instead, he composes what I think everyone would agree is a very idyllic scene. Failing to make money, Gauguin returned to France to try and advance his career there. That led to his painting The Yellow Christ. It's one of his best, and also one of the most controversial paintings that Gauguin produced when he returned to Paris. He went actually to the Brittany region, which he loved. This is dated 1888 to 1889 because it took him some time to complete it. It shows his move away from Impressionism. Simple lines ring the figures and frankly rather crude. By contrast, the peasants' costumes are very accurate and they're detailed. The crucifixion centered in the Brittany landscape, northern France. It's shocking. Gauguin loved the Breton people for their rustic and superstitious natures. Here the women are dressed as they would in the 19th century, but they're placed in the same time period as the crucifixion is happening. He painted this work, a major work, to illustrate the evolution of his style. His use of large, flat areas of bold colors and his use of color in unexpected ways drew the attention of another budding artist, one you know as Vincent van Gogh. In 1888, Gauguin painted Vision After the Sermon. This is one that Van Gogh noticed. It's also titled Jacob's Fight with the Angel, and you can see up above a little miniature of the angel and Jacob fighting together. It marks his move away again from Impressionism. Here he's painted a Bible scene showing rural women at prayer and sharing a collective vision of Jacob and the angel fighting. Painting religious subjects was associated with the Renaissance. For his painting, Gauguin uses bold outlines and large expanses of the same color. Scholars classify this painting as among the first in the modern style, likely based on Gauguin's study of very popular Japanese prints and his work with ceramics, both at the same time. Gauguin called his work during this period synthesism, a synthesis of his using formal elements with the idea or emotion they are meant to elicit. And then the third one I wanted you to see from this period, painted in 1888, it's called Les Miserables, and it's a self-portrait. Painter Vincent van Gogh decided that Gauguin needed to be part of this proposed artist colony that he wanted to form in Arles in the south of France. So to get to know each other, the two exchanged self-portraits and representative artworks. And frankly, Van Gogh saw enough to know this fellow had some talent and he could learn from him. Gauguin saw enough of Van Gogh's work that he had enough talent that he could learn from him. Les Miserables is one of the self-portraits that Gauguin sent Van Gogh when the two exchanged them. And in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a profile portrait of Jean Valjean, the hero in Les Miserables, the book. If you haven't read that one, you need to read that one too. Jean Valjean spent a life as a criminal because he had stolen a single loaf of bread as a child. Van Gogh identified with some of this and loved that Gauguin was using Les Miserables as a focal point for his own portrait. Gauguin loved the Japanese prints. Van Gogh loved the Japanese prints. And Van Gogh was especially impressed more than with any other thing, the use of color of Gauguin. So Gauguin moved to Arles to join the colony, which would now be two, in the fall of 1888. And the two worked together very closely for 9 weeks. They would select something, a scene, a person, an object, that they would each paint, and then they would show each other what they had painted, and they would learn from each other what they were doing. The two worked together for 9 weeks until they had a terrible, terrible argument, during which time Van Gogh's ear was cut off in the fight. Gauguin left 2 days later. One of the great controversies has always been who cut off his ear. The fact that Gauguin left is not so much a statement about his anger at Van Gogh, but it's a statement about his concern about being charged with a criminal act. So there's a lot of evidence that it was Gauguin who actually cut off Van Gogh's ear. Gauguin always loved Mette, his Danish wife, but the woman who really had his heart was his mother. This is a portrait of his mother that he painted in 1989, and you can see it's very romantic. It's very soft. She looks very sweet. And while she has Western clothing, it's not so overt, just a little tiny bow in her hair and so forth. She had died in 1867 while he was sailing with the Merchant Marine, and he didn't even know she was dead until his sister's letter got to him a number of months later. So he never even got to tell her goodbye. As he's moving further away from Western civilization, he still remembers his mother with love, and he painted this portrait to preserve it. This is a painting called The Spirit of the Dead Watching. He painted it in 1892. Between 1892 and 1893, Gauguin lived and painted in Tahiti. He produced 40 canvases in the 2 years there, but his health was severely compromised because he had a very poor diet, he has no money, and he has lack of care. The Spirit of Dead Watching is one of his most famous paintings from this period. It combines the ordinary with the extraordinary in one canvas. The sleeper has a visitor. A female spirit is watching over her at the foot of the bed. Gauguin is illustrating a Tahitian folklore belief that spirits roam at night and thus are sharing the world with the living, and they look over the living. In September 1901, Gauguin decided to permanently move to the Marquesas. Tahiti had become too westernized and too expensive for him to make it. He settled in the village of Atuana on an island, and he lived there until he died of a heart attack in May 1903. And there he built a home for himself, which he called the House of Joy. Today, his home has been reconstructed and amended a bit to become the Paul Gauguin Cultural Center. The original home was built by Gauguin with the help of his neighbors. The entire home was intended by Gauguin to be a work of art. It was decorated with beautiful carvings. The ground floor was left open and used for dining and living, and then the top floor was for sleeping, and it was his studio. Today, it is reconstructed, and many, many people come to visit it. While Gauguin was in the French Polynesian area, he found love and peace in those islands. He actually had 2 wives in Polynesia. The first one he married when she was 15 years old in a local traditional native ceremony. The legal age for marriage at this time was 13. So it was a legal union. And this first wife was his model for the Spirit of Dead Watching. This is a second photograph of Gauguin. He's in the center with 2 Tahitian ladies and a friend. And the 2 women may have been his wives, but that is impossible to prove. From 1896 to 1903, he was married to Pahura. He returned to Polynesia. She was a native there. She was a model for a number of his works during this final period. A word about these photographs. Neither of these photos can be authenticated beyond question. They have no date and were bought at a very small French auction in July of 2015. The purchaser is a reputable art dealer based in Munich. He has since had them examined by a number of art historians and art specialists, and the consensus is that they are authentic and they do picture Gauguin. Gauguin died. His tomb was designed by himself, and it's one of the only graves in the Calvary Cemetery that does not have a cross. And the stone at the front reads very simply, Paul Gauguin, 1903. Now, we would expect to have his birth date on there. He didn't want it on there. He just wanted the date of his death. As I said, he was 54 years old. He died of a heart attack. His body was found by a local pastor who described Gauguin as, quote, an enemy of God, close quote. At the time of his death, Gauguin was facing a pending prison sentence because he was in dispute with local authorities and the Catholic Church. The day after he died, he was buried in Calvary Cemetery, exactly where he had selected his final resting place to be. He had designed the tomb. He had selected the location. There's an interesting story, though, that goes with that tomb. In 1894, during his last time living in Paris, Gauguin sculpted again. This time he did Oviri, which translates as savage or wild, but he called it his murderess. In 1900, when he felt his health diminishing, he's living in the Marquesas, he asked the man who was hoping to sell this particular sculpture in France to send it to him. He intended to place it on his burial tomb in Tahiti as his tombstone. The man never sent it. He was 46, Gauguin, or 47, when he sculpted Oviri. The theme of the piece is death, savagery, and wildness. It depicts a goddess figure crushing the life out of a dead she-wolf's cub. This sculpture is the largest one Gauguin ever made, and it's considered by art critics to be his masterpiece. Today, it's in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. A bronze cast of the original sculpture was made and placed on Gauguin's grave, as he has wished, on his tombstone in 1973. What is Gauguin's legacy? We now know a lot more about him than we did before a few years ago when Before and After was discovered. But we've known all along, as the decades have passed, that his art has become more and more significant, more and more important. The thing that kind of jogs people is this decision of his to leave Western civilization behind and to live with the indigenous people and live a very simple life. Cindy Kang, with the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, had this to say about him in 2011. Yet his self-imposed exile to the South Seas was not so much an escape from Paris as a bid to become the new leader of the Parisian avant-garde. Gauguin cultivated and inhabited a dual image of himself, as on the one hand, a wolfish wild man, and on the other, a sensitive martyr to art. His notoriety helped to promote his astonishing work. So, he may have been a really smart self-promoter and on top of everything else. In 1897, just 6 years before he died, Gauguin painted what most scholars judge to be his finest work, The title of it, Where Do We Come From? Where Are We? Where Are We Going? And the painting is a study of life and death. It's big. It's the biggest canvas that he ever painted. And it has drenched color in it. You have blue. He sees blue as the color of life all the way through until it sort of gets diminished with death. We're going to take this apart now and look at it because the story, it is a story. It tells a story of life and death, but it reads from right to left instead of the traditional way that we would be reading and Europeans would be reading from left to right. So we'll look at the first one. The far right is called Childhood. And in it, you see much blue, a little bit of yellow up in the corner, but blue is the color he's emphasizing on childhood. And you see a little child laying down on his back at the bottom, and the parents obviously looking over, and even the puppy looking over and taking care of the child during childhood. The center section is young adulthood. This is one when one is out on his own and he's living his life. If he has a career, if he works, that's what's happening here. If he has a love, marriage, that's what's happening here. Again, you've got a lot of the blues, but now yellow is coming in more. It's really a life force color for him. And then the final section to the far left is called Old Age and Death. It's especially interesting. You have the woman in the center who's contemplating the woman at the far left. The woman at the far left is that lady in her old age. She's frail, she's grayed, she's obviously elderly. In the upper right-hand corner of the painting, you see an image of a goddess, a Tahitian goddess, overlooking these last years of a person's life. And then Gauguin does a little swath of yellow again here to show it is the end. This painting is considered priceless. It's one of the most significant paintings in all of art history. It is part of a permanent collection in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Speaking of legacy, 16 years after Gauguin's death, something happened that would have no doubt pleased at least part of his personality. His life became the inspiration for another work of art, a novel. In 1919, Somerset Maugham published The Moon and Sixpence. The primary character, Charles Strickland, is an obvious character study based on the life of Paul Gauguin. As Sarah Morehouse writes in a book review, Maugham's character Strickland was a singularly unfeeling man who thought nothing of deserting the people who loved him. Having forged a stable career as a stockbroker and raised 2 children with a loving wife, he vanishes for Paris, taking his friend's wife as a mistress, and sets out to become the greatest painter of his age. Disgusted by conventionality, Strickland seeks a more authentic existence in communion with nature. This, he feels, will allow him to paint properly. He then deserts Europe for Tahiti, where, after marrying a teenage local, he achieves artistic triumph before suffering a horrible, prolonged death, penance for his sins, perhaps. That novel is well worth a read. I think it should be a must-read for art majors and artists alike, and especially for those of us who just love art. Gauguin explained his move to Polynesia in his own words, and I think it's important for us to see what he said about this radical life decision. He wrote, "I am leaving in order to have peace and quiet, to be rid of the influence of civilization. I only want to do simple, very simple art, and to be able to do that, I have to immerse myself in virgin nature, see no one but savages, live their life with no other thought in my mind but to render the way a child would, the concepts formed in my brain, and to do this with the aid of nothing but the primitive means of art, the only means that are good and true. We'll always wonder about Gauguin. I wish they had found his memoir before and after a few decades sooner so that we could have had a little better appreciation of his life and what he stood for. But you know, to think about him, you have to realize this was a wondrous life. He was a successful merchant marine and sailor for a while. He was a successful businessman for a while. He was a happily married man with children for a while. He was a sculptor for a while, a master printmaker for a while, a serious student of Polynesian culture toward the end of his life, and a painter who influenced art in ways that shattered the previous rules, and he's still doing it.